Hello, students. All right, today we are going to look at viruses, and this is the classification unit, and I guarantee that this is something that you're probably interested in learning, right? Life has changed a little bit, as you can see here from the picture, before COVID and after COVID. So let's look at these tiny little particles that are disrupting our lives. So this is the general structure of a virus. A virus is composed of a short piece of nucleic acid, either DNA or RNA. So we know that viruses have some sort of genetic material inside, okay, and it could be either one of these two. And then it is surrounded by a protein coat called the capsid. So it's this layer right here. And then some viruses have outer membranes. So we know, for example, COVID-19 follows this type of structure here. It has a capsid, and then it has these spike proteins here. And then these spike proteins is what help the virus attach to our cells. But understand that viruses come in a variety of shapes. So some characteristics of viruses is that they're very small. They're smaller than prokaryotic cells. And they're not really considered cells because they are not living. And what do I mean by that? Well, they're not considered living unless they come inside a living cell. And this living cell is called a host cell. So once the virus comes inside a living cell, then it uses this host cell to reproduce. So that's why we don't really consider it living, because it cannot reproduce unless it's inside of a host cell. So how do viruses infect? Well, they inject their DNA or RNA material into cells, and then they make copies of themselves, and then that's why they can reproduce so quickly. So here's an example of the lytic cycle of a virus, and this is one way that a virus can reproduce. As you can see here, the virus with its spike protein here attaches to a host cell. This is what we think of a host cell, and it could be an animal cell, but it can also be a plant cell. We know that there's viruses that attack plants. And the virus injects its genetic material into the host cell. It releases its DNA or its RNA, and then this DNA can be copied, and this is what we call DNA replication, or this DNA can be made into RNA. That's what we call transcription. And then this RNA can be made into proteins. That's what we call translation. And then these proteins here are used to make more copies of the virus. So now you have all these viruses here. If the virus ruptures or bursts or lyses the cell and it leaves the interior of this host cell, then these new viruses here can now go and infect other cells. So this bursting of this cell membrane of the host cell is what we regard this cycle to be lytic. So lytic means that it bursts the cell or the host cell that it infects. There's another way viruses can reproduce and remain dormant for some time. Here we see the virus injecting its DNA into a host cell. And then what happens here, the host cell is going to reproduce, but it's going to reproduce with a little piece of the viral DNA incorporated into the own host cell's DNA. So this DNA belongs to the host cell, and now it incorporates some of the viral DNA. So now you have a little piece of the virus inside this host cell, and then this host cell can remain dormant for some time, but it's carrying a little piece of the viral DNA. So this is what we refer to as the lysogenic cycle. And a virus can go from a lysogenic cycle to a lytic cycle, as you can see here. So it can stay dormant for quite some time, right? We know that the HIV virus is a virus that can stay dormant for some time, and then it can actually damage these cells and burst these host cells as it turns into a lytic cycle. All right, so let's look at some vocab words here. So a pathogen is any microorganism that makes you sick, any microorganism that causes a disease. So we know for sure that viruses are an example of a pathogen, but so are bacteria, and so are some protists and some funguses and some worms. So most pathogens are transmitted by touch, inhalation, sexual contact, or contaminated food or water. Retroviruses are a type of viruses, for example, the herpes simplex 1 type of virus, and this is a type of virus whose genetic material is RNA. So it's an RNA virus, but once it injects its RNA into a host cell, what it does is it works backwards. So retro means back. So it takes its RNA and it works backwards to make DNA. So DNA is transcribed from RNA, which is the reversal of what usually happens, right? So usually DNA makes RNA, but in retroviruses, RNA reverses back to DNA. The problem with doing this is that these retroviruses can become highly mutable, so they carry lots of mutations, and that makes them very hard to fight, as they're constantly changing from RNA to DNA and then back from DNA to RNA. So viruses cause disease, and we know that from common viruses like the flu, chickenpox, herpes, and HIV. And these are viruses that infect humans. But there are other viruses, like I was saying before, that can infect plants, like the tobacco mosaic virus or the tomato spotted wilt virus. And then there's other viruses that will only infect certain types of animals. So we know that rabies and parvovirus will infect dogs. And then there's other types of infectious agents. For example, viroids are these smallest infectious pathogens that are very, very, very tiny. So they're the smallest type of pathogens, and they're single-strand circular DNA, and they don't have a protein coat. And then there's these prions, and these are these infectious agents that are completely made up of protein. These two types of infectious agents have really captured scientists because it's really interesting studying how these types of pathogens, not having the usual characteristics and composition, can actually become infectious and pathogenic. So we know that viruses do not respond to antibiotics. Antibiotics are only there to kill bacteria, and we're going to look at this in the next lesson. But we know that viruses can be targeted via vaccines. So you probably heard a lot about the COVID vaccine right now. So what vaccines do is vaccines in and of themselves do not kill the virus. What the vaccine does is that it stimulates your own immune system, and your immune system is made up of a whole bunch of arsenal of white blood cells. And once your immune system gets activated, then your own immune system is going to attack the virus that it's harming you. So the vaccine can be made, now we know that there's different technology to make vaccines. Before, vaccines were made from attenuated viruses. So, for example, Edward Jenner, he was an English physician, and he developed the first successful vaccine for smallpox in the late 1700s. And what he did was he injected, he studied cowpox, which is similar to smallpox, and he took some of the cowpox and he injected some of that cowpox into certain people, and including his son, which was a little bit controversial. But he noticed that milkmaids that would milk cows and who were exposed to cowpox did not get smallpox. So he learned that if you were injected with a weaker form of the virus, and this is what we call an attenuated virus, then your immune system would launch a response and fight off that stronger virus. So he was the first one to do this with the smallpox vaccine, and luckily we were able to eradicate smallpox. So here are some viruses in the news, some examples of what they look like and their different compositions and structures. You might have heard of some of those. And of course, you probably heard of coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, which is the COVID-19 virus. And it's a novel virus that was discovered in 2019. And here you see the structure of the coronavirus. It's called corona. It's part of the coronavirus family because it's made up of all these spike proteins that surround it, and it makes it look like a crown, like a corona. So we know that coronavirus, just like any other virus, it needs a host cell. It needs to infect a host cell. So here's the infection process of the coronavirus. Notice that just like any other virus, it has either DNA or RNA. For coronavirus, it actually has RNA as its genetic material. Oops, not here because this is the host cell, sorry. This is the viral RNA right here. And notice the coronavirus has these little spike proteins, and it uses that to attach to receptors of host cells. So this is the host cell, and this is the coronavirus. And this is the RNA here in yellow inside the coronavirus. So the spike proteins of the coronavirus are going to latch on to receptor proteins in our host cells. And we know that coronavirus attaches to lung cells and does quite a number in our lung cells, right? So once the coronavirus is able to attach to these receptor cells, well, what does it do? It enters our cells and it releases its RNA. So the viral RNA enters, and it enters all the way into the nucleus. So now it uses the nucleus to make more copies of RNA, and then this RNA is going to make more copies of proteins, which in turn is going to use our own host cells' assembly machinery to make more copies of the virus. So here you see how the coronavirus enters our cells, our lung cells, and it uses our own cells to make more copies of itself, and it bursts many of these cells. Sometimes not only does it burst our cells, but it clogs up our lung cells with mucus, which can then lead to bacterial infections, which can then lead to pneumonia. So luckily, we do have a vaccine now for COVID-19, and there's different types of approved vaccines right now. The RNA vaccine, which is the vaccine that was developed by companies known as Moderna and Pfizer, these are vaccines that work a little bit different than the attenuated virus vaccine. These vaccines, the way that they work is that you are injected, the actual vaccine that you are injected with is mRNA. So you're being injected with the nucleic acid or the genetic component for the spike protein of the coronavirus. And to protect that RNA, because it degrades, you surround it with the lipoprotein particles and you inject it intramuscular. So then what happens is once the mRNA is injected into the muscle, the vaccine is going to trigger your immune system, right? So here the vaccine is just the genetic information that is then going to allow your body with that RNA information to make spike proteins. And then what's going to happen once these spike proteins are made in your body? Well, your antibodies, which are part of your immune system, are going to go to work. and your antibodies are going to recognize these spike proteins, and they are going to lock them in place and then take them to other cells to be destroyed. So what you're doing here is you're eliciting an immune response so that you make antibodies in your body that can then, if you do at some point get infected with the real coronavirus, you have antibodies to fight that off, and you won't even know when your body is fighting it off. So these antibodies then turn into these memory cells that have learned how to fight off this spike protein of the coronavirus, so that will render you safe. But notice that in no way, shape, or form is this mRNA getting incorporated into your cells, right? The mRNA doesn't get incorporated into your DNA. No, the mRNA is just the instructions for your cells to make these spike proteins, and then for these spike proteins to be recognized and targeted by cells in your immune system known as antibodies. Now, there's still, the news is ever changing, so scientists are still looking to see how effective these vaccines are going to be, if we're going to need a booster shot in a year or if we're not. So we just have to keep listening to the news and following the scientists' recommendations. So we know that good hygiene limits the spread of both bacterial and viral diseases. So that's why we need to wash our hands constantly. We get rid of the virus by washing our hands with soap and water. Making sure that if we cough, that we cover our cough, that we cough into the inside of our elbow, and that once vaccines are available, we do become vaccinated to elicit that immune response so that we can keep fighting these pathogens or these viruses. Okay, that's it for today.